poll for the 2 questions that you wanted to ask, so we can go through that.
Okay, great. I'm happy to wait a few minutes if you want to wait maybe 3 minutes till 12:05 or whatever works. Let me know.
Well, I've got a little bit to say, so.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So again, to everybody who is on the line today, thank you for joining us. To those of you who were on the line with us last week, I apologize again for the technical difficulties that we were experiencing, and thank you for coming back on with us today for the second installment in the collab series on HTA engagement. My name is Sabrina Hanna, and I'm the Managing Director at the Cancer Collaborative, and I will be the moderator for this chat room on data collection in the age of real-world evidence. And in this chat room, we're going to look at how to collect data from the patient's lived experience with disease and formulate this information into evidence to guide health technology assessment decision-making. HTA provides the basis for reimbursement decisions, which are largely based on data collected from randomized controlled trials. While HTA may collect data from patient groups and organizations, it is less well understood how patient perspectives contribute to this process. As real-world evidence continues to emerge as an opportunity to supplement existing data, we will look at how patient groups can use this first-hand experience to achieve meaningful engagement in HTA. Presenting on this topic is Dr. Famita Gwadri-Sridhar, the founder and Chief Executive Officer of Pulseinfoframe. Dr. Gwadri-Sridhar is a pharmacist, epidemiologist, and methodologist with over 25 years of experience in clinical trials, health analytics, clinical disease outcomes, and registries. She was awarded a Career Scientist Award in 2006 from the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and through her work founded the first knowledge translation health informatics lab in North America, creating a collaborative ecosystem for interdisciplinary research. She's a founding member of the Special Interest Group in Medical Adherence at the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Measurement, and has received over $10 million in peer-reviewed funding and actively continues her professional interests in enabling technologies for better provider workflow and patient engagement. She holds her PhD in research methodology and health economics from McMaster University. So just before I hand it over to Famita, I want to remind you that there is going to be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions through the dedicated box on the left, and we'll have time to answer all of those at the end. If you are unable to stay for the whole of the webinar, it will be recorded and archived on the Cancer Collaborative site at roomc.co, and I will send out an email when that is up, and it should be up within 24 to 48 hours. So during the presentation, please do feel free to submit your questions as they come to you. And with that, thank you, Famita, for being with us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Sabrina, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. So I really look forward to having a dialogue with all of you who are online. I'd like to maybe start with today's objectives. What I'd like to do is focus on real-world evidence and real-world data. I'll talk a little bit about precision medicine because health technology assessment is becoming far more complex as we think about, the types of drugs when you're looking at gene therapy, et cetera. And then also how to think about HTA or health technology assessment as it relates to relevant outcomes, focusing on the accelerated path to market and why that's important, and then pricing and reimbursement. I'm also going to provide a couple of case studies that will help sort of orient us to different perspectives from people who are involved in real-world data and real-world evidence for health technology assessment. So in terms of, I think, Sabrina, thank you very much. She's done a lovely introduction. And what I wanted to find out from you, we don't have a formal poll system set up, but if I could just maybe in the chat hear from people in terms of what their goals are for this webinar, whether it's just general learning, supporting registry diversification and thinking about sources of real-world data, or whether you want to just recalibrate what you're currently doing or something totally different. So let me just wait 20, 30 seconds. Feel free to put anything in the chat that you think might be helpful.
Famita, I did create a poll.
Oh,
We could give it a try and see if it works.
sure. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so if you want to go through the questions.
Yep. Do you want me to say them again?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So general learning, supporting planned registry diversification, concrete recommendations to design or recalibrate registries, in particular for health technology assessment, to enhance the utility of the registry or database you have. And then the fourth one is really something else, not related to any of the other three.
And I believe the second question is up as well if you want to go through that one.
Oh. So the second question is really, do you currently have a registry? And so it's a yes or a no.
So I've got some stats here. So it's 40% for general learning.
Okay.
First question. And do you have a registry? 40% no.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you. And for those of you who have a registry or even a database, what is the primary purpose of your registry or database? Is it for quality improvement, accreditation, research? And for other, what I'd like to do is maybe have that as health technology assessment. Okay. Sabrina, would you like me to go forward?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about a little bit about what we do as a company. I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time on PulseInfoFrame because I think most of you are here to really understand health technology assessment or are involved in HTA. But I do want to talk a little bit about registries and real world data. And one of the things that I like us to kind of orient ourselves with is we hear a lot about sources of data and how health technology assessment is done. And through the cases that I show, I'm going to use a couple of examples from the UK through NICE. But essentially, when we think about many of the organizations, whether you're a pharmaceutical company, a patient advocacy group, a government official, or somebody really involved at a policy level, one of the challenges we all have is really determining the sources of data that are going to be helpful for us to make a decision about whether or not to fund something, and or what are the types of data that I need to be able to present to pricing reimbursement bodies. And generally what people do is they focus on existing sources of data. Many of those sources of data are actually publicly available. They could include, in the US in particular, claims data. Those are a little bit harder to get in Canada, but there are access to administrative databases as well as to some of the government databases. But the reality is, to really establish whether or not something should be funded, we need to understand the impact on an individual and then individuals who have that particular condition. And so we really think about registries as providing sort of the depth of information and data that's required to be able to kind of build out the information that we already have from publicly available sources. But we also want something that can grow with us. So when I talk to people about what do they need today, it's really about thinking very clearly about the endpoints and outcomes that are going to be of interest, and then engaging in something or investing in a technology that's ultimately going to grow with you. The other thing that we know more and more about HTA, and I gave a presentation last year at Columbia Business School, really talking about the impact and the availability of data. There has been a tendency to really focus on data in a particular country to help inform that country. But the reality is that most of us understand that it's very difficult just to rely on one country, given the different payment mechanisms, et cetera. So if we look at the United States as an example, there are 13 different ways that people get treatment paid for. And in Canada, there are provincial differences. In Europe, etc., there are country level differences. And there's a much broader appetite now to consider that you want to be able to bring in data from multiple parts of the world. And so whatever you do, think about building something that will give you international coverage. And as part of that, the information has to be safe. And safe is an important word because we have in Canada PIPEDA or PHIPAA, in the United States HIPAA, and then globally GDPR, which is really, making sure that individuals who provide data have affirmation that the data are going to meet strict privacy and security rules. And so knowledge around those laws and regulations are important. And why do I say this? Because sometimes what we've seen is that people want to just very quickly start up an Excel spreadsheet or something that they want to share with people around the world and collect data. There is a tremendous risk that those data will not be accepted by regulators and by people who are making decisions about what to fund because of the compliance issues. It's also important to think about how to keep your data clean. And I know a lot of this sounds like motherhood, but we have to be pragmatic about the types of data that we want to collect. So in other words, if we're just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, but we don't know what we're going to do with the data, then it becomes a challenge. And the more data there is that we have to collect, the more challenging it becomes. And that's why we get into problems in part with missing data. And that's really what I mean by clean. And whoever you work with, make sure that they're going to be around for the long term and have the expertise to support you. As a company, then, Pulse really thinks about the world this way. We have different groups, different stakeholders, and each of us are collecting our own types of information and data. The reality is that sometimes there's a lot of duplication of the data, and because we're not completely kind of huddled together and working well, and we're isolated, which almost seems like it is for people today, but we're not benefiting from each other's data. And this becomes more and more important, even when we look at situations like we're all facing globally today, where the ability to collect information and data is going to become more challenging. And so we have to look at ways to share. And so what we think about ourselves as a company is we want to be able to identify the data that are going to be relevant for patients and advocacy groups, for healthcare providers, as well as for pharmaceutical companies and payers. And what does that mean? It means that, look, if I'm a patient with a particular disease, there's information that is very relevant to patients that may not be as relevant to clinicians. And so we have to be able to characterize from both the patient preference perspective as well as from a clinically relevant perspective. And the convergence of those data really starts to create a very rich data ecosystem for us to help inform not just drug development, but the real world data helps us really support pricing reimbursement once a product is on the market. Our main areas of focus are really in rare disease and cancer, but we also work as a company in many other diseases, including kidney disease in the United States and pediatric narcolepsy. But we have built a platform technology that focuses really in some key areas. And rare disease patients in particular are very isolated, and to be able to collect the information that's relevant for them to help support drug development is something that we've been focused on for many years. When you think about real-world data, what we think about really is that there's a registry, there has to be information that comes out of it, and our solution, and any solution you work with, should really have a view that you're trying to both accelerate the scientific research, but also optimize the information that's coming in and ultimately establish reimbursement and cost of therapy strategies. And what do I mean by that? It means that, we often have drugs that come to market and then nobody wants to pay for them. You see this in particular in rare diseases and some of the precision medicine areas in cancer, where they're expensive therapies that have taken a lot of effort to bring to market. But regrettably, the information around the real-world data, the patient-reported outcome measures, and other relevant information that are going to help inform the policymakers about whether or not to pay for something are missing. And so if we think about this from a strategic perspective, alongside a clinical trial, well in advance of a drug coming to market, each of us can play a role in defining the types of data that are going to be relevant to help get drugs funded. So just to reorient us, health technology assessments and health economics outcomes research really do require high quality data. And more, it's just not the quality of data, which is important, but it's the depth of the data, because we're getting into more complexities in terms of the types of diseases. And given today that we have far better diagnostic power with gene sequencing, et cetera, these data are becoming deeper and deeper so that we can identify the types of patients who are going to benefit most from the treatment. And how does this relate back to health technology assessment? If you look at some of the common cancer treatments that are used, even radiation for prostate cancer patients, there are several patients who have a specific gene variant who actually are resistant to radiation, and yet we continue to treat those patients with radiation, even though they're not going to respond. And why is that? Because when we actually look at getting the funding envelopes, we're looking at a broad population. And ultimately, if we're able to narrow down the population, not to necessarily take away the access to treatment, but to have much more precise opportunities for benefit, I think that that's really an area that we can focus on. So what do we need to do this? The variables that are important to identify the disease of interest, the treatments of interest, and the demographic and clinical characteristics for a particular disease are going to be very important for us to help characterize up front, because those are the types of data that are going to be required both by the regulators and the health technology assessment groups who are deciding whether or not to pay for treatment. The intervention outcomes and effectiveness. So clinically, we generally will look at time to treatment, first date of treatment, overall survival, progression, but we also need to look beyond that. So it's not just how long do I live, but then if we look at the patient-reported outcome measures, such as the health-related quality of life, that's a very important consideration. So more and more, we're beginning to not just look at the clinical outcomes, which are absolutely important, but those are often defined through the clinical trials. We're also looking at whether or not it impacts people's quality of life. And I think we all know why that's important, because prolonged survival with a terrible quality of life isn't necessarily something that people are going to want to sign up for. And that's an individual decision. What are PREMs? PREMs are the patient-reported experience measures. So how was my treatment? How did I enjoy or not enjoy interacting with the healthcare team? What were the access to care limitations that I had, etc.? These are all very important questions that are also part of the equation when we're making decisions about what to fund and not fund and where to fund it. And then finally, the surrogate outcomes. As I mentioned, we're very used to looking at the usual clinical outcomes, but often we forget about the surrogate outcomes, which are equally important, which are just not related to the hard outcomes such as survival, but very much around disease-free survival, around quality of life, and about the impact on my ability to work and productivity and absenteeism. Okay, so essentially health technology assessment is focused on, yes, assessing the impact of that treatment, whether it's a technology or a drug, but very much so, not just at a population level, but more and more at an individual level, and looking beyond the clinical outcomes and really considering from a patient's perspective what's important to them. So how do we go about thinking about, how do we start, essentially? And I'm going to maybe repeat a little bit of what I said, but first we have to find the right population. And what do I mean by that? And that's, so I've got contact database there. When you think about clinical trials are often focused on a very specific population who meet certain eligibility criteria. Those patients don't always represent real-world patients because all of us are different human beings. So as an example, if we took a case in cardiovascular disease, which is a common disease in many countries, in cardiovascular disease studies where we're studying lipid-lowering medication as an example, the studies are done in certain cohorts and certain types of patients, either for secondary, primarily for secondary prevention in patients who have already had a heart attack. Notwithstanding that, there's certain eligibility criteria. But in real life, many physicians, in order to reduce the risk of future heart attacks, are using these drugs in a cohort or population that is much broader. So in other words, we're not just looking at 45 to 65-year-old people, primarily male, who are at higher risk. Often we're using these drugs in a broader cohort. So what we need to do when we're actually doing these assessments in health technology is to think about a population that's going to be representative of the real world population, the real life population that's going to have access to treatment. And so we sometimes will start that by creating a contact database. And then we will start to define the types of disease variables that are important, as well as the patient-reported outcome measures. And finally, if we need to use very deep data, we will then start to develop a clinical disease registry. So in other words, when we look at collecting data, it's not just from a single source. It's from the patient, it's from the existing healthcare system, and then it's also potentially from publicly available repositories of data. So this slide is entitled Interoperability, and this is not a slide just about pipes, even though it looks like they're pipes, there's a stethoscope, etc. What do I mean by this? In order to really get people to buy in, it means that we have to share data. It means we have to share information. And if you remember the slide I showed you about Pulse in the middle of that ecosystem of different stakeholders, what that means is that we have to have a shared consent, there has to be trust, but there has to be integration of data. And by setting up an appropriate governance structure that allows each of the constituents to share data, we're then able to leverage not just each other's expertise, but we're able to leverage the data that each of us are collecting. And so all of the registries that we build, we actually put together a governance structure, which means that if I'm sharing data as a patient or as a clinician, I agree that I'm going to share de-identified data with others so that we can begin to fast track our opportunity, not just to accelerate drugs to market, but to accelerate the ability to get those drugs funded. And so really interoperability means that we all operate together, sometimes as one, but with a common goal for what we need. A slide that looks very complicated, but that's real life today. Think about where we are, regrettably globally right now in the middle of a pandemic. We have people looking at different sources of data, making decisions on what they see. But really what's becoming more and more evident to all of us is that people are sometimes isolated from their ability to be able to actually interact with others or with systems. And so in this data tsunami, we're all wearing wearables. We have our smartphones, we're wearing watches. In diseases, often you have people who have monitors on their body. In kids who are seizing, we use seizure trackers. But where is all of this data going? It's really critical for us not to waste any data that are being collected. And the data tsunami is really just to illustrate the fact that there are so many sources of data. And we don't need to strive for perfection and try to collect every single piece of data, but we do need to help identify those sources of data and then in a sequential and organized way, collect data from those existing sources. The key area that you see up here is patient engagement. Without the impact or input from patients, we can't really figure out how treatment affects an individual. So that's critical. Diagnostic labs, more and more important given gene sequencing, etc. Electronic medical records are the source of health data, but they're not all of the data because only some of those data are structured. And often there's a lot of data that's tied up in notes. And those notes provide us with valuable information about the patient, which we sometimes miss because they're so difficult to get. So let's say in our ideal world now, with all of these data, we're able to collect them, we're able to map them because they need to be organized in a way that's actually understandable. They're just not a bunch of variables that come together. They have to make sense. And to do that, what we do is we map them to a global standard that the FDA have recommended to be able to collect data in an ontology or an umbrella that allow us to characterize the data. So as an example, you call something high blood pressure or hypertension, I call it something else. Those mean the same thing. We need to map it exactly the same way. So whatever you do in health technology assessment, remember that it's not just the quality of the data, it's the interpretation of the data. What does it mean to different people? And it has to mean the same thing. Ultimately, then you have this rich data repository, and we want to be able to share the data across with regulators, to provide analytics, and ultimately to bring the opportunities for clinical trials and other outcome measurement to patients. So there's a lot of data floating around here. That's why we need to make sure that it's organized. And this is one of my favorite slides because it shows really a whole spaghetti of different strands. So as opposed to the DNA strands being tightly wound and all of the data being very, very organized, for us to move from data to knowledge, we have to make sure that the data are timely. In other words, medicine is evolving very quickly. We're getting new treatments on the market all the time, and yet we continue to look back because we haven't caught up with what's going to happen. So as we think about developing drugs, the patient's voice is very important. It should be included as part of that discussion, but also to provide information from a patient's perspective as an example that's going to be timely when a drug is approved. It has to be relevant. Endpoints that are not relevant to the discussion have less value. What do I mean by that? We had done some work in limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, which is a rare condition, and there are 56 different subtypes, but regardless, we were looking at 3 of them. On a clinical side, the clinicians were collecting information about the 6-minute walk test, which is essentially where a patient is asked to walk on a treadmill for 6 minutes or on the ground, monitoring their gait as well as the time that it takes to achieve that distance. They're not walking for 6 minutes. It's just called a 6-minute walk test, not a 6 mile, sorry. And then, but when you talk to patients who have that condition, their interest is not so much in 6 minutes. It's in, can I actually get out of a wheelchair? Do I have to use an assisted device? Now you can see that there's a disconnect in terms of the outcomes that are relevant clinically versus from a patient's perspective. And so relevance is not just a single-sided view. Relevance is really encompassing the view of all of the parties who are part of that ecosystem. The data have to be accessible, and this is a really important consideration. I showed you the governance slide earlier in terms of interoperability. Just this week, I was talking to a patient group who have been collecting data since 2000. And the data are accessible only to certain people, certain clinicians, certain patients. And patients are collecting an enormous amount of data that they want to have people access and use. Having data locked up where it's not accessible to others doesn't really help anybody. And so I implore all of us to think about how we make the data accessible, obviously considering the privacy regulations. But remember, we're collecting data not just to publish papers, but because we want the data to be actionable and turn into knowledge. So let's think about, let's drill down a little bit and look at the sources of data and what's available. Existing data sources I've alluded to. Most of us who go to a hospital know there's an electronic health record. There's a lab where we go and have our blood drawn. There's genomics data, big data, wearables, but those don't represent specific diseases necessarily. The unique data that we have to think about, which is what we do, is we think very carefully about each disease and the data that comes directly from patients and clinicians that characterize that disease. Those data don't exist in the masses, and when you're doing health technology assessment, the assessment is being made on a cohort of patients with a particular condition. We're not getting approvals for all of cancer. We're getting approvals, as an example, for melanoma. And in melanoma, you're looking at metastatic melanoma or adjuvant melanoma. So again, health technology assessment is beginning to drill down and look at specific types of patients who would benefit. And therefore, we have to think about the specific types of data that need to be collected to support that. So ultimately, we need to capture the data, organize it, analyze it, curate it, and share it. And that's where the data can be used ultimately for benchmarking. And in our case, what we're talking about today is pricing reimbursement and also to accelerate research, because sometimes you need to do new research and generate new hypotheses, and those data don't necessarily come from clinical trials, they come from the real world. And those, by being able to characterize what we need to help address the health technology assessment requirements, is also a really unique way to look at data that we can all leverage. I've only put up the next two slides to kind of characterize all of the different sources of data, in particular registries. So many groups keep data, but they're all using the data for something potentially that's different. So professional societies have their own data, government entities have their own data, and we go on, by organization, by community, by manufacturer. So why did I put this up here? To basically illustrate that it is complex. People have different data, and if they're all collecting the same data, and some are collecting similar data, would it not sort of behoove us to start to collaborate and share some of the data that we already have so that we're not duplicating things? I alluded to the data standards ecosystem. This is really important. People collect data without really understanding how it maps. And this is OMOP is really, it's an observational medical outcomes partnership. And it's an open source community that's global, that looks at mapping data in a way that is organized and structured so that we're all using the data in the same way. Now, regrettably, it doesn't have an extensive dictionary that sort of encompasses every single disease, and so we all have to write extensions. But the critical thing is that when you start doing health technology assessment or building a data repository to do that, define your data elements. Try to map them in a way that are going to be recognized by the regulators. And you're maybe thinking, well, the regulators don't always make the decision about health technology assessment, and you're right. So I've got the FDA on the right side of that slide, looking at CDISC, which is the way that the FDA likes to see data for trials. But often what's happening more and more, particularly in precision medicine and rare diseases, is that we're actually looking at smaller studies. And alongside the smaller studies, we're looking at doing health technology assessment at the same time. And that means that the data have to be in a format that the regulator will accept. And that's it. The FDA and EMA have different requirements. But CDISC is a very common standard that I believe the Japanese regulators also accept. So if we're doing that, why not collect the data once and use it for multiple purposes? Use the data for both trials and early acceptance, and then use the data, the same data for health technology assessment where you can extend what you're collecting, but at least you're only doing it once. And so this is the way that we think of the world. These are some of the diseases that we support. But basically, it's like the foundation of a house. You don't want to be building a new house every time you have a disease because that's very expensive. And if you come from advocacy, you have limited resources and you want to do the best with what you have. If you're coming from a pharmaceutical company with a big pipeline, or you are a smaller company that has a very limited pipeline, you want to leverage what you have and not continue to pay for technology or a platform that you're not going to be able to scale. So the way we've thought about this world is really to have a platform technology that supports multiple diseases. So think of them as rooms that sit in the same house, so you don't have to keep building a new house, you just build a new room. And the beauty of that is you also get to learn from other diseases. So even in health technology assessment, you learn from what's been approved in some diseases and learn from the types of variables that were collected so that ultimately you can leverage other people's knowledge to advance what you're interested in your own disease area of interest. I think I've done this slide in a different way somewhere else, but it's really referring back to the framework that the FDA put in place for real-world evidence and real-world data. Again, this is really important for health technology assessment. On the right-hand side, you'll see that patient engagement is very critical, not just for input for natural histories, but obviously for determining what's going to be funded, which you see on the left-hand side, which is claims and billing activity. So let's do a couple of case studies. If I'm a pharmaceutical company, here's my innovation lens, right? I have not always maybe engage with multiple people in the community or multiple companies. The issue is that maybe I have or don't have technical infrastructure, and I want to think about what I need, which is the action. So what am I going to do to advance what I need? I maybe want to work with other companies. I want to have innovative partnership models, and I want to make sure that I have the technical infrastructure to be able to scale not just that disease, but ultimately to be able to scale across my pipeline. And the impact that we're seeing, for companies is that if they're able to work together and share non or pre-competitive information with one another, then they're able to actually create these very sustainable registries that will meet their needs, specifically for their own needs, because they can leverage these networks to add in data variables that will be relevant to them, but also to create more innovative mechanisms to figure out what happens in the real world so they can provide that information back to the funders. What do I mean by that? So in melanoma, as an example, one of the drugs, immunotherapy drugs that was on the market early, was highly effective, but if patients failed, there was nowhere for them to go, in part because the first line treatment was also could create a fair bit of toxicity. By looking at real world data, companies were able to establish that, in fact, if they changed the sequencing of treatment and used another combination of treatments as first line in some patients, they would reduce the risk of the adverse event toxicity in the patients. And in those who failed, they were then able to go to the treatment that was initially being used as first line. So I'm illustrating that really the importance of prospective longitudinal data cannot be underestimated, and it has a tremendous amount of value, especially if people work together. Let's look at this now from a pricing, reimbursement, and policy lens. So regulatory bodies such as NICE in the UK are increasingly requesting sophisticated and nuanced types of data to support decision making. So, and this is all publicly available. So NICE had rejected Biogen's Spinraza application, and that's a drug that's used for SMA, which is a muscular atrophy. The action, however, they took was they asked, it was a risk sharing arrangement, and what they wanted to do was ensure that in the long run they were getting continuous information from patients so that they weren't just approving something without really understanding the impact for patients. And now, as part of that, patients who got treatment had to commit that they were also going to continue to provide data so that they could be assessed from the perspective of whether the treatment was bringing them value. And so essentially, if you look at the impact, it changed the framework and the mechanism by which that ecosystem collaborated. So that was the diagram I showed you with the circles. There have to be innovative approaches now for all of us because data collection is extremely expensive. So we need ecosystem stakeholder engagement strategies. There has to be some risk sharing, which often companies are being asked to do. Patient-reported outcomes, a key tenet of health technology assessment, have to be included. And ultimately, there have to be complementary services. So it's not just, hey, I'm a patient, I'm going to use my treatment. But sometimes with oral treatments, patients have a lot of side effects. They need support. And so there has to be support and education to help educate patients about the treatment and the opportunities to benefit from the treatment in face of sometimes having side effects. And for companies, at least they know that they can get drugs and new treatments approved and that they're working hand in hand with the population that benefits, who are the patients. And so really it becomes a rich ecosystem of stakeholders. This is just another view of the initial slide that I showed you, so I won't go through it, but I do want to focus on the analytics and patient engagement. Key part of health technology assessment is patient engagement. If I'm a patient who's contributing data into a registry or a database or working with my clinician to provide information, what do I get out of it? Well, we can't expect people to give and not get. And so one of the tenets of engagement is being able to share back with patients information that is relevant to them and for them. And what that means is that, you have to be able to show people their scores potentially, how they're doing compared to other people. Again, there can be a lot of modifications but engagement is truly engagement. Giving patients the opportunity to enter data on different platforms, so the collection mechanism. And this was very telling for me when I was talking to some parents of children who were part of a CDKL5 community, which is a rare pediatric condition. And one of the moms said to me, you know, these questions are great, but Famita, when my daughter's having a seizure and I'm holding her with one hand, I'm not going to open up the computer to try to enter a question. I'm going to have a mobile phone. So I need something that's easy that I can use with one hand. And so again, part of the assessment is understanding how we're going to collect that high quality data that's both relevant and easily accessible. And then being able to show data. So now we've collected all this data. What do we do with it? We need to use it. We need to illustrate it. We need to share it. And so here are a couple of views of how we share data. You know, I don't know how to write code anymore for statistical analyses. So I want to be able to look at data as a policymaker, as a provider, as a pharmaceutical company, or a patient. I want to be able to visualize the data in a way that makes sense to me. And I'm not saying all of these data points would be shared with every single constituent, but really, if I'm running a system and I'm conducting an observational study to collect data on health technology and to assess it, I want to know how I'm doing. And I don't want to know 2 years from today, I want to know real time. And so in our administrative dashboards, we provide a lot of information, and I would ask each of you who are involved in collecting data to make sure that you know on a regular basis how people are doing. So for example, we can see, and this is all made up data, by the way, it's just to illustrate the types of dashboards that are useful. You know, if I've consented, you know, a certain population, and that population, or I've sent out a request to consent and nobody's consented, then I have a problem. So you can see on the left that I have a portion of people who have consented, but that means I have to go back out to people who haven't consented, but at least I know that early. I know that of the people who have consented, most of them have actually completed data. Terrific. So you get a lot of views on how people are doing, and that's important because you want to be able to evaluate and potentially retool if people are having challenges with data collection. In terms of the requirements from a regulatory perspective, whoever you work with, you need to make sure that there's 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. This is relevant to data collection in any platform, which is a requirement by the FDA. The second is that you're collecting information from, if you focus on the pricing and reimbursement on the bottom, information is coming in from both public and private sources, and you need to be able to encourage, you know, the ability to share data, obviously with appropriate data sharing agreements in place. Ultimately, think about all the cool stuff we can do with the data. It's about health technology assessment, but also innovative clinical trial designs, collaboration across all of the different stakeholders to be able to put in grants to study new research questions. And ultimately, what we really want is high quality data. And let's not lose sight of that, because just collecting data for the sake of it, not so great. And I want to go to this slide now, which really illustrates a great case study for one of the largest registries that we've built. It's the Canadian Melanoma Research Network that is run by Dr. Scott Ernst, who's a medical oncologist. And when we started this registry, it was really in 3 Canadian sites in Ontario, and now it's expanded into 12 major sites and will continue to expand globally. But this is where it becomes really exciting, because you're collecting real world data. Those data are being used for research. We're adding more and more data because for the first time in the last 7 years, there's so many new opportunities to treat patients with immunotherapy and advances, not just for metastatic patients, but for patients with adjuvant. But how we think about the real world evidence and the whole technology assessment is shown with the green boxes, where we show you the new technology We're actually looking at incremental effectiveness in the real world. We're looking at how to use the data for reimbursement. And then early, trying to also get some early use exceptions to get treatment funded. And often we will work with patient advocacy groups to provide them with the data that they need to support with policymakers the funding opportunities. Because often there are many anecdotal stories which are very compelling, but don't provide the data points necessary for policymakers to make a decision. And so again, the initial reimbursement decisions can be supported by real-world data. And ultimately, many people are looking at mature use. So this is sort of the life cycle of health technology assessment and real-world data. And in mature use, what happens is you get more and more new treatments on the market. You need to continue to evaluate the comparative effectiveness. And ultimately, as you get new indications, for example, from metastatic to adjuvant, you need to be able to very quickly tilt and be able to collect the relevant information that's going to be important to get funding for those new indications. So, key considerations. Start with articulating the purpose. What is the most appropriate data source to achieve your purpose? Look at the literature. Don't try to replicate everything on your own. There are lots of people who know a lot of stuff. We should all reach out to them. We certainly do that all the time. Look at the feasibility of what you're doing. Identify a team that's going to do this so you're not just an N of one. And then figure out what type of governance is going to be needed to make sure that if people are sharing data, that they know in full transparency how the data are going to be used. And ultimately, if we go down to the bottom, we want to engage people who actually know how to do this. So health economists, health services researchers, engaging with clinicians, patients, pharmaceutical or biotech companies who have a lot of experience getting their drugs funded and on the market. I won't go through all of these international rules because I've already covered many of them, but it goes back to one of the earlier slides, and I want to go back to that. Hold on, maybe it's gone. Okay, so I may just. So, begin with discovery. Figure out what you want before you start doing it. Then look at people that you could work with. Look at synergies and opportunities. You don't always have the luxury to be retooling all the time because there's a very finite window within which you want to be able to collect the right data. So don't just collect data for the sake of doing it. I mean, yesterday I talked to a patient group who, they collected a lot of data, none of it is joined up. So make sure that you have a mechanism to join up their data and don't go it alone. Engage with people who have done this and can help you and support you going through it. Because, it's too precious time from many people to waste. So I guess a question for you: did we achieve our objectives? And if not, hopefully, we'll get some feedback from you on how to do that. And I'm going to open it now for Q&A, if that's okay, Sabrina. We have 10 minutes. And thank you. Sabrina, will you be reading questions if they come through in the chat? Hi, Sabrina, shall I turn it over to you? here. Yeah, we're just trying to pull up all the chat questions. Just give us 1 second. Great, Sabrina, you have some questions. I think Sabrina's typing in a question. So the question, just so that it's recorded, is, so for groups that don't have registries who are building patient submissions through SurveyMonkey, how do they identify sources of data? Great question. And essentially what they have to do is identify patients and patient groups that may have, that may be available through a contact database to share information about their experience. So patient-reported experience measure, sorry, that's the second question, but really the identifying sources of data is to review the literature, to see what data sources exist with the types of data that they're looking at, and also to reach out to advocacy groups in that particular disease. And that's one way to identify sources of data. There's several others, but those are two starting points. The second is really a question around PREMs. So patient-reported experience measures actually really ask the patient about the experience they had in the healthcare as part of an intervention or assessment. So for example, right now we are deploying a bowel cancer patient-reported outcome measure. And as part of that, we're also asking what the patient's experience was with their healthcare provider, and also with respect to access to care. So those are specifically related to their experience with the healthcare system and with the way that they were provided with the diagnoses. I believe there's another question coming in. So the question is around surrogate endpoints, including productivity, and these could be valuable data sets for reimbursement decision for HTA, although underlooked. So let me explain. Surrogate endpoints are really important, and you're right, they're not often thought of when we think about health technology assessment. So imagine we get a treatment, and that treatment now is they're considering quality of life, which is the patient-reported outcome measures, but there are also other things like, can I go back to work? What is my absenteeism and productivity? There are many endpoints where sometimes we don't even have a quality of life instrument, and there are other endpoints that are equally important that we have to consider. And many of these endpoints come from something called game and gaming theory also, where we're looking at the impact on patients in particular of that treatment, not just on the quantity of time, but the quality of time and the impact on their day-to-day living. And those surrogate endpoints can be both clinical or patient-facing. And so we have to be creative about the types of data that we think about collecting. But before we collect the data, we also have to be really keen and understand from the regulator or the health technology assessment body how they're going to use the data. So in other words, don't just start collecting information, have a discussion with the HTA body, whether it's a group in Canada like CADITH or the UK NICE or US organizations, to really find out what they'll be looking for so that the data are not being wasted. Are there any other questions? Oh, sorry. You said it's not just the quality of the data, but also the interpretation of data. How do we take that anecdotal experience and interpret it? Great question. So the anecdotal experience is really what we call qualitative information, and that qualitative information really helps articulate the patient journey. So what's anecdotal to each of the people actually has a lot of relevance. And I mentioned that this week I was talking to some patient groups, and some of the moms said to me that they've collected reams and reams of information of things that their child went through. And when they talked to other parents, they realized that there were a lot of similarities. So document the anecdotal information, talk to other people, and then talk to experts who know how to take that qualitative information and create themes so that those themes then become common themes that can then be shared with the regulators or the health technology assessment folks, and that we can figure out ways in terms of how best to measure that information. So I think our time is up. Sabrina, is there one more question? Okay, great. Thank you so much for the opportunity today. And we look forward to speaking with you in the future. Sabrina will share the slides and the recording. And again, thank you for your time today. Take care.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, finally. So sorry about that. So thank you, Famita. Thank you so much for being with us today. It will be recorded and it will be up on the roomc.co website. If you do want to get in touch with Famita and talk about registries, Famita, I think you did have a slide with an email.
Yes.
Or would you like to?
Yeah. So you can either contact me, Famita, FBMIDA at pulseinfoframe.com, or Joe Chanel's name is at the end of the slides, and feel free to contact him.
Okay, great. So there will be announcements on the third and fourth installments of the HTA engagement series, and those will be sent out to you shortly. And again, thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Famita.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.